Can you give a 30,000-foot view of secondary service connection and some of the key ways it differs from primary service connection?
Sure. Service connection is the basic element for VA disability compensation. And it is the connecting, if you will, of something that happened during the veteran's military service to a medical condition that the veteran has now.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Tony Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran who is seeking VA disability benefits, you should subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome, and let me just tell you who we are. I'm Francis Jackson, this is Christian Terrison, and we're from Jackson and MacNichol, a law firm that specializes in getting justice for veterans on their VA disability claims. And what's this all about? Well, today we're going to talk about a concept called secondary service connection, which is actually a very important issue in VA disability. And who is this show for? Well, this show is for veterans, of course, but it's for a larger audience. It's for anyone who cares about a veteran, spouse, child, other relative, friend, just someone who is supporting veterans in the community. This show is for all these folks. So without further elaboration, let's go to today's show.
All right. So as you mentioned, we're going to be discussing secondary service connection. Can you, give a 30,000-foot view of secondary service connection and some of the key ways it differs from primary service connection?
Sure. Service connection is the basic element for VA disability compensation. And it is the connecting, if you will, of something that happened during the veteran's military service to a medical condition that the veteran has now, by using a medical report from typically a physician, but it could be a nurse or nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant or a chiropractor or whoever, some medical person who explains to the VA how the current medical problem is connected to what happened in service. Secondary service connection is important because it brings in other medical conditions that were not directly caused by service, but for which the veteran is now entitled to have VA disability compensation benefits. And the way that works is if you have a condition that is service-connected or that you're trying to get service-connected, which causes another problem, that other medical problem can also be connected to service. That's called secondary service connection. So it's important because it allows the veteran to establish service connection for additional conditions and thus entitlement to additional financial benefits, even though the secondary service connection, that condition, did not begin or is not related directly to service. It is instead related to or caused by the primary service-connected condition.
So what are some examples of secondarily service-connected conditions that veterans might not realize qualify?
Well, one we see all the time is we have a veteran with a service-connected back condition or a back condition that he is moving for service connection for. And then he'll develop what's called radiculopathy, which is a nerve pain going down one or both legs, typically caused by a back condition such as an injury to the back that impacts the spinal nerves. And those nerves, of course, go down to the legs. And if there is pressure on the nerves where they leave the spine in the back, it will cause pain and numbness and tingling and various sensations down the leg, which can now be service-connected because they are caused by the back problem, which is the primary service-connected condition.
And you hinted at it earlier, but what evidence is most crucial in establishing a secondary service connection?
Well, typically the things that are most important are, one, a formal diagnosis of the secondary condition, and two, a medical opinion showing that the reason that the veteran has that condition, or at least a significant part of the reason the veteran has that condition, is because of the underlying service-connected condition. In our example, the back and the leg pain.
Okay. Can a mental health condition have secondary service connection to a physical condition?
It can. One place that we often see a problem is for veterans with PTSD or anxiety or some other mental health conditions. For whatever reason, those folks often seem to develop sleep apnea. And there are many others. The folks with anxiety, for example, or PTSD, also are prone to develop cardiovascular problems, heart problems, or hypertension. You know, the body is all interconnected.
Right. Well,
so one thing can cause another.
yeah, and I've worked with a number of veterans who will have a very severe physical condition, back pain, knee pain, that severely limits the activities they can undertake, and they'll have depression as a result of that loss of ability.
Yeah, sad but common.
No, definitely. So how does the rating process work for a condition that is secondarily service-connected?
Well, essentially, the rating part works about the same as for a directly service-connected condition. The VA has to assess the level of severity of the condition, and then they match that to the rating schedule. For most conditions, there is some limit on the maximum level of disability that the VA awards for it. For example, with back conditions, typically the maximum will be either 20 or 40%, depending on whether or not there's intervertebral disc syndrome in addition to the underlying back problem. But the VA will look at the secondary condition and rate it just the same way they would if it was a primary condition, a directly service-connected condition. The only thing that gets confusing for people is when the VA rates more than one condition, they have what they call the combined ratings table. And they don't just add up, say you have 20% for your left shoulder, 20% for your right shoulder, 50% for PTSD, and 10% each for your left and right foot and for tinnitus. They don't just take those numbers and add them all together. What they do is they start with the biggest number. In the example I just gave you, it would be the 50% for the PTSD. And then they add the others serially. But the way they do it, the conceptual overview, if you will, is that, okay, you started out with a 50% rating for PTSD. And so you have a 20% rating for each shoulder. So each of those 20%, the first 20% is 20% of the amount left after the 50%. So 20% of the remaining 50%. And then the next 20% is 20% of what's left after that 20% has been applied. So that each successive rating number in the sequence applies to a smaller pool, if you will, and results, therefore, in a smaller percent. So if you have a 10% rating but there's only 20% left because you're already at a combined 80%, that 10% translates to 10% of the remaining 20%, which is only 2%. So it's not additive. It is sort of weirdly geometric.
Yeah. What are some of the common mistakes you've seen veterans make when claiming something with a secondary service connection?
Well, what I've seen several times is the VA will deny a claim saying that the condition that's being claimed is actually secondary to a different claim that has not yet been proven or established as service connected. So what it means is people aren't going in the right order, if you will. So, for example, a person makes a claim for neuropathy in their feet. The neuropathy is actually secondary to diabetes, but they haven't made the claim to establish the diabetes as service-connected. So because the diabetes isn't yet service-connected, they can't get the neuropathy stemming from the diabetes service-connected as secondary, because first they have to prove that the diabetes is itself service-connected. But once they do, then the secondary will follow.
So when making an initial claim, can you do a mixture of primary and secondary service-connected conditions?
Yes, you can. And we see that all the time. But, we've seen several where we were asked by the veteran to help with the claim after the claim was already well underway. And we've run into this, you're pursuing the secondary claim, but you haven't made the claim for the primary. And we have to kind of go back and sort of back and fill to get that all sorted out. But it can be done.
Okay. Well, and that leads into my next question, I guess, is what are some of the ways that an attorney or other, experienced qualified representative can help when it comes to the process of establishing secondary service connection?
Well, I think the primary thing is talking with the veteran and identifying all the potential claims, whether they're primary or secondary. It is not at all uncommon for veterans to make a claim for a particular condition that they think is service-connected, but not to recognize that they have other conditions that also are potentially service-connected, either as primary service connection or as secondary. And so it's really important to kind of go through with the veteran and talk about all of their medical problems, whatever they are. And then you can kind of see, okay, well, these are the ones that the veteran thinks are service-connected, and we can evaluate whether or not we think that can be proven. And then for the ones where we think primary service connection can be proven, then we can look at, okay, what's left? Are any of these secondary to these primary claims? And if so, as you mentioned, you can make the claim for both primary and secondary at the same time. There's no magic to having to wait. It's just that you can't be granted on the secondary claims until there's a grant on the primary.
And that could happen in the same...
It can happen simultaneously, yes.
Yeah. So it's rather than the cart before the horse, you have the cart and horse together, and that works out fine.
Yes, it's important to have both together.
So if somebody, is successful in claiming secondary service connection for a condition, but then that condition worsens as time goes on, is it possible for veterans to increase their rating on that condition?
Sure. Doesn't matter whether it's directly service-connected or secondary. If the condition worsens, then you can always apply for an increase in the rating level and the corresponding level of benefits.
Okay. And would that, I guess, be a new claim or a...
Typically, that would be a new claim. What sometimes happens is that things will increase in severity while the claim is being processed by the VA. And so in those instances, you don't need a separate claim for an increase, because when the VA ultimately grants service connection, they will look at the level of disability over the entire period, and sometimes they will do what are called staged ratings, meaning, okay, when you first came to us with this claim, you were only at the 10% level, but has now progressed, and by the time we got around to finishing the claim and granting it, you were at the 30% level. And they'll say, okay, 10% for this period, and then it got worse, 30% for this period. But if a claim has already been made and resolved so that service connection was granted with any level of service connection from 0 on up, you can always go back after that claim is closed and say, okay, the condition has gotten worse and I'm making a claim for an increase, and the VA will examine that and grant it or deny it as the case may be.
I know that there are, a number of instances where the secondary service connection isn't necessarily as obvious. What are some ways that veterans can strengthen that connection, offer evidence establishing that secondary service connection?
Well, these things kind of break down into sort of factual and medical, if you will. Most of the time, what you're talking about will require a medical opinion from a doctor or other medical person conversant in that area of medicine to explain the relationship between the primary condition and the secondary condition that service connection is being requested for. But sometimes it's purely a factual thing. The VA will not understand why what happened to generate the original service-connected condition also created the problems that result in the secondary condition. But most commonly, it's medical.
So if a veteran has a condition that existed prior to service, and then in service something happens that exacerbates that condition beyond its normal course, that can be grounds for disability compensation.
Yes.
If there's a secondary service connection, or I guess is it permissible to have a secondary service connection for a condition that begins in service that exacerbates a pre-existing condition beyond its normal course?
Sure. Yeah, the VA recognizes that conditions can be aggravated. And this whole pre-existing condition thing gets a little complicated because the VA makes a distinction between, if you will, kind of how your body is put together and specific medical conditions. So that if the argument is that you were kind of born this way and it's not really a medical problem that came along afterwards, even the way the VA breaks it up, that makes it a little more difficult. But even if that's what you have, when you can show that the symptomology became worse as a result of what happened in service, you can establish what the VA calls aggravation and a higher level of benefits.
Gotcha. What advice would you give to veterans who are just beginning to apply with a secondary service connection?
Well, applying for secondary service connections really isn't significantly different from applying for any service-connected condition. The big issues with secondary service connection tend to be, number one, identifying it. So as we talked about earlier, it's really important to talk with the veteran and look at all the medical conditions and determine which of them may be directly connected to service and whether any of the other medical conditions may be secondary. So for example, it's pretty common for folks who have service-connected diabetes to have secondary service connection issues. Neuropathy in the feet is very common, sometimes neuropathy in the hands, but that's less common. Also, another problem that is quite common for people with serious diabetes is eye difficulties. There's degeneration that occurs in the eyes with diabetes sometimes. And so it's just really important to start by looking at every medical condition and then kind of grouping them in terms of, okay, these are the things that are directly, potentially connectable to service, but then off one or more of those, there are these other secondary service connection possibilities, and to look at that and establish that those are the possibilities and make the claims. The other piece, though, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier, is making sure that you have the medical evidence to show the connection, the secondary service connection. It is not always intuitive that a particular problem will cause a different kind of problem. You know, one of the things that one of our attorneys has been working on a lot lately is problems with asbestos. We tend to think of asbestos as causing just lung problems, but in fact, it turns out that asbestos can lead to a number of different kinds of problems that I wasn't aware of years ago when I started doing this, and really only the medical evidence is only now emerging. So it's just really important to figure out what the possibilities are and then look at the medical literature. Certainly is a good place to start in terms of talking about, okay, this could be secondary to that, and then getting the medical evidence in the form of a report from an expert to prove that.
Yeah. Well, and also you can ask your physician if you suspect something's caused by a condition you have already. It never hurts to ask.
Absolutely, and many times the primary care physician who is seeing you and treating you will be in a position to say that, A caused B and help you with that.
No, definitely. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Victory Over VA. Please be sure to subscribe and tune in again next week.
We hope to see you then. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.